Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story. After all the hardships, James and Diep have finally reunited and are about to get married. But just when everything seems perfect, a huge shock occurs. Min, Diep's old friend, turns out to be the traitor, siding with James's enemy. Can their love survive all the schemes? Stay tuned to find out the outcome, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. James stood still in the forest, his heart racing as he spotted Diep in the distance. Her steps were slow and weary, yet her gaze was fixed on him with a mix of exhaustion and hope. After months of separation, the distance between them was no longer physical but emotional. James walked quickly toward her, unable to hold back the tears that streamed down his face. "Diep," he whispered, his voice trembling. She looked at him, stunned, before offering a faint smile. "James, I can't believe it." They stood facing each other, and the space between them wasn't one of mere distance. It was the accumulation of months of pain and longing. Without a word, they rushed into each other's arms, the weight of their hardships fading in that single embrace. "I found you," James murmured, his eyes closing as he breathed in the scent of her. "I'll never let you go again." Diep rested her head against his chest, tears falling freely now. "I thought I lost you forever." In that moment, everything they had suffered, every obstacle they had faced, melted away. There was only the warmth of their love, the comfort of being reunited. All the words they didn't say were understood in the silence. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, the world around them fading as they held on to each other. Finally, after so long, truly home. The days following their reunion passed in a blur of shared smiles and quiet moments, but James knew one thing for sure. He could never let Diep go again. The pain of the past had woven them together, but now, standing in the presence of the woman he loved, he knew there was only one way to secure their future. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the land, James took Diep's hand and led her to the quiet spot where they had first shared their hopes and dreams. The air was crisp, and the world seemed to hold its breath as he dropped to one knee. "Diep," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "We've been through so much, and I've lost so much along the way. But finding you again, being with you, has made everything worth it. I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me? Will you be my forever?" Diep's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes welled with tears, and she looked at James as though seeing him for the first time. The weight of the journey they'd both endured was clear in her eyes, but so was the love they shared. A love that had survived everything life had thrown at them. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Yes, James, I will marry you." James slid the ring onto her finger, a symbol of their past, present, and future. As they embraced, the promise of forever felt as real as the earth beneath their feet. The days following Diep's acceptance were filled with joy and anticipation as James and Diep began planning their wedding. They envisioned a simple ceremony, surrounded by a small circle of loved ones, free from the chaos of the past. The future seemed bright, and the pain of their previous struggles faded into distant memories. However, just as they were beginning to prepare for the happiest day of their lives, a shadow from James's past reared its ugly head. Unbeknownst to them, Hung, a dangerous enemy from James's past, had learned about their plans. His jealousy and resentment toward James had only grown over the years, and now, seeing James about to find happiness, he couldn't let it go unnoticed. James received an anonymous message one evening, the words chilling and ominous. "You can't escape your past, James. Your happiness won't last long." At first, James tried to brush off the threat, convinced that it was just a warning from an old rival. But as the days wore on, he began to sense something was off. People close to him were acting strange, and strange figures began appearing around their home. James felt the heavy weight of something sinister looming over their future. Diep, too, noticed the change in James. She could feel the tension in the air, though he tried to shield her from the details. But her love for him and the bond they had told her that something was wrong. She refused to let fear dictate their happiness. "We'll face this together," she said to James one evening, her voice steady, a quiet resolve in her eyes. "We've made it this far, we're not running now." James, despite the looming threat, knew she was right. Together, they would fight to protect their love, and nothing would stand in their way. The tension in the air was palpable as James and Diep continued with their preparations, trying to keep the happiness of their upcoming wedding alive amidst the growing threat. James had been increasingly vigilant, his usual calm demeanor now replaced with quiet worry. He had his security team on high alert, watching every move, yet Hung's influence seemed to slip through the cracks, an invisible hand that stirred trouble just out of sight. One evening, as Diep and James sat together planning their wedding details, a knock echoed through their quiet home. James froze, his instincts on edge. He rose from his seat, signaling to Diep to stay behind him. His heart raced as he approached the door. To his surprise, standing in the doorway was Min, the last person he expected. Diep's old friend, who had once been a source of comfort during her difficult times, now looked grim, his usual cheerful expression replaced with something darker. "James," Min said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His voice was urgent. "I've heard something that I couldn't ignore. Hung, he's not just targeting you anymore. He's planning something bigger, something that could hurt Diep too." Diep's heart skipped a beat. She stood and walked over to them, her eyes full of concern. "What do you mean, Min?" Min hesitated, his gaze flickering to James, then back to her. "Hung has been making moves to get to you, Diep. He doesn't just want revenge on James. He wants to make sure that no one else is happy, especially you, and I believe he's already made his move." James's grip tightened on the back of the chair. His worst fears were coming true. The man who had once been a shadow in his life was now a very real, dangerous threat. "We have to stop him," James said, his voice resolute. Min nodded. "I'm here to help. We can't let him destroy everything." James turned to Diep, taking her hands into his. "We'll face this together. Nothing can tear us apart." The days after Min's warning felt like a countdown to something inevitable. James and Diep, despite the looming threat, remained determined to move forward with their wedding plans. They knew that no matter what happened, they could not let fear dictate their lives. But the weight of the situation was heavy, and both of them could feel the storm gathering. James set up additional security measures, making sure that Diep was protected at all times. The wedding venue was now being monitored by both his team and Min, who had agreed to stay by their side. The sense of vigilance was almost suffocating, but neither James nor Diep dared to back down. They were getting closer to their moment of happiness, and nothing was going to steal it from them. Not even Hung. But it was in the quietest moments, when they thought everything was in place, that disaster struck. On the eve of their wedding, James received an anonymous message once again. This time, it was different. The words were cryptic, but they carried a clear warning. The clock is ticking, James. If you think you're safe, think again. Diep will be the one to pay the price. James felt his blood run cold. His worst fears had finally come to fruition. Hung wasn't just targeting him anymore. He was targeting Diep, and he was playing a game where James wasn't sure he could protect her. "I won't let him touch you," James whispered fiercely, pulling Diep close to him. "Not now, not ever." But the realization began to settle in. Hung wasn't just a physical threat. He was playing with their emotions, manipulating their every move. And the worst part was, he was getting closer. "I can't lose you, Diep," James continued, his voice filled with desperation. "I will fight with everything I have to make sure we're together." Diep, though frightened, looked at him with unshakable love in her eyes. "We will be together, James. Nothing can separate us. Not him, not anything." Their resolve grew stronger, but they knew it wasn't going to be easy. The wedding might still happen, but it wasn't going to be the joyous celebration they had dreamed of. There was a storm coming, and they were about to face it head on. James and Diep's wedding day arrived, filled with joy and anticipation. They were finally about to start their new life together. But just as they exchanged vows, everything unraveled. Hung, James's old enemy, and his henchmen barged into the ceremony, disrupting their happiness. The tension in the air was thick, and the guests were thrown into chaos. But the biggest shock came when Min, Diep's trusted friend, revealed himself as a traitor, aligning with Hung. His cold words cut deep, and James's world seemed to shatter. The man he trusted, who had helped him in the past, had been working against him all along. The betrayal left both James and Diep shaken, but their love for each other kept them grounded. James, despite the anger boiling inside him, stood firm, determined to protect Diep. "You made a huge mistake, Min," James said, his voice steady. Diep, though shocked, clung to James, refusing to let fear take control. "We'll get through this," she whispered to him, her resolve matching his. With security intervening, the fight wasn't over, but James and Diep were unwavering in their commitment to each other. The wedding turned into a battleground, but they fought for their love, refusing to let anything tear them apart. As the situation calmed, James and Diep shared a quiet moment amidst the chaos, knowing they had survived the worst. Together, they would face whatever came next. As the chaos of the wedding day unfolded, James and Diep found themselves standing at the edge of everything they had hoped for. Min's betrayal stung deeply, but it wasn't enough to break their resolve. James, though shaken by the unexpected turn of events, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the man who had once been his ally. "You chose the wrong side, Min," James said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "You will regret this." Min's expression remained cold, and his alliance with Hung was clear. But even with the odds stacked against them, James and Diep refused to back down. Diep, though still reeling from the shock, clung to James, her love for him burning brighter than the fear creeping into her heart. "We're not letting this destroy us," she whispered to him, her grip tightening on his arm. As the security team moved in to handle Hung and his men, James and Diep knew the battle wasn't over. Min's betrayal had shattered their trust, but it had also fueled their determination to protect the life they had fought so hard to build. The ceremony had turned into a war zone, but through the smoke and confusion, the bond between James and Diep grew even stronger. With each passing second, their love became the shield that would protect them from everything Hung and his forces tried to tear apart. As the last of Hung's men were taken into custody, James turned to Diep, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We've made it through this, together." Diep smiled, her heart light with relief and love. "Together, always."
Câu chuyện bắt đầu khi James và Diep cuối cùng cũng đoàn tụ sau một thời gian xa cách. Cảm xúc của họ lẫn lộn, niềm vui, vỡ òa đến sự lo lắng không dứt. Cuối cùng tình yêu của họ đã được vượt qua thử thách sau nhiều đau khổ, khó khăn và những cuộc đấu tranh cá nhân. James quyết định cầu hôn Diep và cả hai sẽ kết hôn, bắt đầu một cuộc sống mới, quên đi những ngày khổ sở đã qua. Tuy nhiên, hạnh phúc của họ đã không kéo dài khi cả hai chuẩn bị cho đám cưới. Một âm mưu bất ngờ xuất hiện. Những kẻ thù của James bắt đầu quấy rối, phá vỡ những kế hoạch của họ, và các tình huống căng thẳng bắt đầu xuất hiện khi những kẻ này tìm cách chia rẽ họ, lợi dụng những quan điểm trong quá khứ. Liệu James và Diep có thể vượt qua những thế này bởi tình yêu của họ hay không?